To get started, I wanted you to hear a story and then reflect on that story for a moment. The story goes this way. I've learned to read people's faces the moment they hear my name. It only takes a second. The polite smile stiffens, eyes narrow. Sometimes they try to hide it, say something like, "Oh, I didn't expect you to speak so well," or "You don't look like you're from here." But the meaning is always the same. You're not one of us. I moved to this town 2 years ago for work, a small city, lots of churches, nice parks. People waved at each other while mowing their yards. I thought this would be a good place to make a fresh start. I keep to myself. I work hard, volunteered shelter once a week, not looking to make a splash, only to live with some dignity. But no matter how long I stay, I'm still that guy from that place. People ask questions they wouldn't ask anyone else. What is it like from where you're from? With a tone that suggests I grew up in a war zone. Did your parents ever teach you about God? As if I could possibly have a faith of my own. One man in church would even shake my hand. He looked at me like I was in contamination, not a newcomer. I didn't choose my birthplace. I didn't choose my last name or the way my accent colors certain words. But somehow it all feels like a mark I can't erase. And yet I stay. Not because I love being an outsider, but because I believe that some people can learn to see deeper. I've met a few who look past my background. They see me as a brother, not a stranger. And those moments make the pain bearable. So I wanted to ask you the question, how would you feel? Like an outcast? How do outcasts feel? Well, we say that word, but we're not sure exactly what it means to us. You can't depend on anybody because you don't know when you may be betrayed next. Okay? How does this guy feel? How does he feel in church? Comfortable? Unwanted? What makes people feel that way? What's not being said? Preacher comes up on Sunday and says, "We're a warm, welcoming church. We're glad you're here." But he gets a different message, doesn't it? Which is easier to serve, a stranger or someone you know? Which would be easier to you? So why not? Why is that? It's fairly predictable. You know how they're going to react. You don't always know that about somebody else. Now, the reverse question is, which is harder? Helping someone you dislike or accepting help from them? Hardest thing in the world to do is to help someone that you don't like and they don't like you either. I don't know if you've ever thought about that or not. I've told the story before, but it still applies. And that is, I had a member at my previous church who he couldn't stand me. And he made it very plain because when I get up to preach, he'd open his newspaper like this. Now, if there's another vision of disdain, I don't know what it is. And people kept saying, "You got to do something about that." I said, "What am I supposed to do?" But the problem was he and his wife, he's an older fellow, he's like in his 50s. He and his wife had triplets. One of the triplets had a hole in his heart and was struggling a lot. My wife came up here for some reason, for spring break or whatever, and I decided I was going to apply the dictum of Romans chapter 12 to heap coals on your enemy's head. And so I thought, what can I do? Try to solve the situation. That's the scariest thing I've ever had to ask, by the way. And I remember I thought, well, they've got this baby is in trouble and they're struggling. So I will fix them something to eat. Now that's a dangerous proposition for me. I found one of my wife's recipes for tortilla casserole, chicken tortilla casserole. And I swear to people, I wasn't trying to poison these people. Understand that my motives are pure. I fixed this. I went up to the porch. I knocked on the door, and he came to the door. He said, "What do you want?" There's a good visit. And I said, "Well, I know that you're in trouble, and I wanted to fix you something. Maybe this will help in some of those times where you need it." You put it in the freezer or whatever. And he took it, didn't thank me, and then closed the door. So I went back home. I did everything I could at that point. And then about 3 months later, I got a call at 1:30 in the morning from an elder's wife that said, "Can you go to the hospital? That baby died." So I went to the hospital, not knowing what to expect. And the mother sitting there rocking this dead child, and it's rocking. I sat there for a full 30 minutes in silence. A nurse came in and whispered in my ear, says, "We really need to take care of this now." I said, "Okay." I said, "It's time to let go." And she gave child to the nurse. We started planning a funeral. I did this funeral. The casket was about this size, about a large size shoe. And I did that funeral. And when they came back, he pulled me into the room. And he said, now, when somebody says, "I need to talk to you," and they had not been kind in the past, I don't know about your system, but mine goes, and so I went back there. I said, "Okay, what can I do for you?" And he said, "I owe you an apology. You treated me better than I deserve to be treated." And now I told him, I said, "Well, I'm glad that's true." I said, "I was hopeful that perhaps this could do something for all of us." And they moved a few months later. But that was the hardest thing I ever do, is to help someone who couldn't stand who I was. That's what the problem is that we're going to look at today. Someone always is like that to us. Someone always is. And the question is, how does Jesus treat them? There's a whole class of people in the book of Luke that is like that. They are called the Samaritans. Now, what exactly are the Samaritans? Who are they? We use that term and we kind of loosely know what's going on, I suppose, but it's interesting what it is. It comes out of their genesis is the fall of Samaria in 722 BC, where the Assyrian army has taken over the world, and they have swept through all the conquering nations. They've conquered all these nations and have taken people captive and toppled empires, if you will. One of those was the northern 10 tribes of Israel, and they destroyed them. And in fact, you read in 2 Samuel chapter 17 about the fall and about the reasons for the fall. It says the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of their plunderers until he thrust them from his presence. Those are not kind words. And the reason is because they had separated from the United Kingdom back in the time of Jeroboam I. And it says he warned them through his servants, the prophets. They would not listen. So the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile, into Assyria, and there they still are. Interesting little passage, not complimentary at all. And so when you read about what happens here, the Assyrians were different than the Babylonians. 100 years later, the Babylonians would conquer everything, and they just take people captive, bring them over into Babylon, and expect them to assimilate. Not what the Assyrians did. The Assyrians had a different style. They didn't want to conquer people. They wanted to crush a culture. And the way you crush the culture was very simple. You would take the best Israelites, the shopkeepers, the wealthy, the educated, the able, and you take them to Assyria, and then you would leave only those that you wouldn't want anywhere else, like the last kid who gets picked on the baseball team. And you would import all of the dregs of your society into that conquered nation, and over time they would intermarry, and the culture would just destruct. Nothing would be left. And so the Samaritans were a blend of the Israelites and the Assyrians, and they become this third race or third group of people called Samaritans. There's some Israelite, they are some Assyrian, but they're neither of each. That's a hard thing to be. They set up their own temple on Mount Gerizim. It was called competitive. We read John 4, for instance, where Jesus goes to the well at Sychar, and he's having this conversation with the woman that is there. And the problem is, when you want to avoid talking about difficult things, you bring up the latest religious controversy. If we can't talk about reality, let's just fight. And that's what she said. Oh, I've got this controversial question. What do you think? And she says, we worship on this mountain. Sychar was at the base of Gerizim. And you say we have to worship in Jerusalem. See, they'd set up a competing place of worship. It's like, there's an old joke that says that if two preachers they're castaways on an island, and they find them later, they will find one that has the first church and the second church, because they couldn't get along with everything. And so they have this concept, different places to worship. They also had a different canon or scripture. The Samaritans only believe in the first 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They rejected the rest of it, probably because it didn't paint a real great picture of them. It has all the problems with their flaws and why God rejected them. They said, we just don't like that picture, so we won't do it. So they rejected the books of history and prophecy that we all read. 2/3 of the books, 2/3 of the Old Testament. They are also ethnically impure, and that makes a difference because they have no legitimacy in society. When you come to Nehemiah chapter 7, Nehemiah is trying to establish who is part of Judah and who is not, who is authentic and who isn't, who's a pretender. And the way you do it is you bring your genealogy and you prove your bloodline. If you don't have a pure bloodline, you don't get any property, you can't stay. The Samaritans couldn't do that. And so for that most part, they were excluded. And so they were excluded by the Jews as heretics and outsiders to the covenant. Now that's an interesting problem, because it happens today. There's a concept that sometimes religious people come up with that says, we're the only ones going to heaven. Now, I don't know who that is. That's God's job, way above my pay grade. All I can say is, here's what God says. However, I do know of some people who have what is called the remnant mentality. We are the faithful remnant, and everybody else has departed the faith. And if you've never experienced that, and you haven't lived very long. I had a friend of mine in my previous church, and he would belong to a group. And there is a group within Churches of Christ who do not believe in supporting children's homes, homes for the aged. And this one was against almost everything, including kitchens in church buildings. You don't think you can fight over small things? Try a fight over a kitchen in a church building. Now, that's straining the gnat to get to the camel, let me tell you. But this group didn't believe in kitchens in the church building. Well, I had this friend, and we got along greatly, but he went to that church. Now, I'm the preacher of a church that has a kitchen in the church building. You know what that makes me? Not to him. We were friends. We could talk. But they had this meeting, and I would go to gospel meetings in the area just because it was good for both of us. And I went to this meeting, and before that meeting started, he got the preacher in the corner. He said, I want to tell you something. I'm going to bring a friend on Tuesday night, and this is where he preaches, and I know what you don't believe, but I don't want you to embarrass him. That's like throwing chum to a shark. So I got there, I'm visiting with my friend and everything, and songs we all sing and know together and pray together. Preacher gets up, and he's not very far into his lesson before he says, and some of you folks there believe it's okay in God's plan to have a kitchen in the church building. You know what kind of damnation you're going to stand? Now, my friend was crawling under the pew at that point in time. I'm just sitting there smiling and thought, wow, you decided to do this, didn't you? See, that's that concept that says there are those of us who are better than others. And the Jews had that about the Samaritans. And in fact, it was so bad, they would organize their travel around them. If you were a Jew and you're traveling, say, from north to south for, say, Passover, you would go, usually, in the caravan, they would cross over the Jordan before they got to the Samaritan border and go through Perea and come back in at a lower place so they didn't have to see the Samaritans. Like crossing the street when you see somebody you don't like, so you don't have to talk to them. Now, Jesus went through Samaria, as we're going to find out today. But this was not the common pattern. And so today, you may wonder about if they are still alive. They are. There's about 900 of them. And some are in Israel, in the northern parts, modern day Israel, by the way. Some are still at the site of Gerizim, which is a town called Nablus. They claim to have an unbroken lineage to the high priest going back 3,600 years. They claim that they're the only ones that are really related to Aaron, which I always find it's an interesting problem, but they somehow have gotten it. And they have their own distinct book of the law, their Torah, but it has about 6,000 differences from how the Jews read it. And so when they read their Bible, it doesn't sound anything like the Jewish Bible. And so they are still there, still doing what they do. And they're still kind of a minority in that case. But if you were a Samaritan, based on what I just told you, I know I told you a lot, how would you expect to be treated if you were in Israel? How would you expect to be treated? Couldn't get gas pumped in your car. Okay. You couldn't get water for your camel, at least. Let's put it that way. That's okay. How would you feel? How would you expect to be treated? How would it color your interactions with other people? You go into a market, for instance. How are you expected to be treated? Isn't that an interesting problem? How does that change you? And that's what's going on behind the scenes in Luke and certain stories. In Matthew, there's only Samaritans mentioned one time, and that is in the limited commission where Jesus says, do not go among the Gentiles or any town of Samaria, only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Prohibition. Mark, there's no mention at all. And so Luke has a whole lot more, even though it's not a huge amount, but the way he does it's important. He has a different light to them. And if you look at what he does in Acts, he has a different view. Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. When Jesus is about to go back into heaven, he tells his disciples, you wait here in Jerusalem for the coming power. And then he says, when you receive that power, when the Holy Spirit comes on you, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea. And here's the cringeworthy moment. Samaria. They hadn't gone to Samaria. You didn't talk truth in Samaria because they didn't believe it. And then to the other parts, most parts of the earth. Different idea. To the point that when you come to Acts chapter 8 and you have Paul holding the cloaks of those who stoned Stephen, there is this threat level. And so everybody begins to scatter. And some of them go to Samaria and they convert Samaritans. Not supposed to go there. They did. So it's interesting that when Luke does this, in Acts, there's this acceptance of them. So where did that come from? But when you read Luke, you understand the story. Our first one is in Luke chapter 9. Luke 9:51 is important because it is where this is the hinge on the door. For Luke, right here is where everything begins to go to the cross. And so they begin that last journey. a lot of things happen on him, but it takes a while. But that time approached for him to be taken up into heaven. So he set out resolutely for Jerusalem. And as he's going, he goes to a Samaritan village to get all things ready, but the people do not welcome him because he was headed to Jerusalem. And James and John get upset about that. They said, you want us to call down fire from heaven and just turn them into Rice Krispie critters? Yeah, we can do that. Just say the word and they'll just disappear off the planet. And Jesus said, leave them alone. And he just left and went to another village. Now, questions we all need to consider, questions that you need to consider. Why do you think the Samaritans rejected Jesus based upon what you know? Why the rejection? Family feuds, for instance, family feuds continue over centuries and nobody remembers how it started. An interesting problem. Would you have rejected Jesus if you had been a Samaritan? Yes. Okay. They didn't see as much. Okay. They were in the dark. You're right about that. It's interesting that happens. Now, was it reasonable for James and John to react as they did, and what caused it? You had been James and John, would you have thought the same thing? Don't you want to look back at people if they've done something wrong to you, especially if now you have the upper hand? You have power you can destroy. Isn't that problem? Do we admire James and John? Do we admire them here? There are people like this, and that's there as well. Why doesn't Jesus condemn the Samaritan? He had a different reason for being on the planet. Now, that's not always true about us. For us, we'd say, I'm protecting me. But Jesus had a far better approach to this, and it was not there. Now, do we ever write off people too quickly? All the time. Why can we do that? So if we've already got the idea in our mind, that's okay. It protects us. Okay. Why do we treat people? Why do we write them off too quickly? Yes. We don't want to be hurt again. That's just it. We've gone through that. We don't want to do it again. I think I've told you this, but one of my favorite expressions from Mark Twain is the kitty cat doesn't walk across a hot stove twice, but neither does it walk across a cold stove. That's us. We've been hurt once. We're not going to put ourselves in that position again. And so both groups were trying to write off the other. Jesus is not worth my time, and they're not worth living. Now, I've always wondered about this story. When you read Acts chapter 8 and there's this success in Samaria, I've always wondered as if some of the converts of Acts chapter 8 are the ones that would not help Jesus in Luke chapter 9. Could it have been sparing them allowed them to hear the gospel at the appropriate moment? Not everybody's ready to hear what they want to hear, what they need to hear. Our next one is a well-known one. This is the story of the Good Samaritan. We call it the Good Samaritan. And it's become so pervasive. And all you got to say in any American society, anywhere, is Good Samaritan. We know what it means. This is a story. And it talks about a lawyer who comes and he wants to know from Jesus. He's testing him. And so he wants to know what the greatest commandments are. Jesus tells him to love the Lord your God with all your mind, heart, soul, and strength. And the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. And instead of stopping there, The lawyer goes on. That tends to be what problems that lawyers have. When they need to put a period, they put a comma. And so it says, then let me ask you, because he wants to be justified, I want you to praise me. And who is my neighbor? And then Jesus goes on to tell the story about a man who falls under the beating of robbers on the road down to Jericho, and he's left for dead. And along comes a priest who passes by on the other side, and along comes a Levite and passes by on the other side. And then here comes a Samaritan who stops and helps, and at his expense takes care of him and plays the hero. And Jesus finally asked the question. He said, so who do you think is the neighbor in this story? And the lawyer said, well, I suppose, I love it. He cannot say the word Samaritan to save his life. I suppose the one who showed mercy. Awesome. Question. You've heard that story, so I don't need to delve into it. Do you think the lawyer felt like he was a good neighbor when he asked that question? Why do you think he thought that? Would you have thought you were a good neighbor? Are you a good neighbor? What makes you a good neighbor? Now, I can keep asking questions you won't answer all day long, so that's okay. Well, he was creating his own cultural expectation was he was doing the right thing. Do we think we're good neighbors? Please pick his brain, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now he's going to parse out all this stuff somehow. But what makes somebody a good neighbor? Okay, so there are people who think they are, but they're not. He hadn't kicked the cat today. That makes him good. That's what that means. And, why? In the story, do you think the priest and Levi are insensitive, that they don't care? A lot of things would happen. They don't know who this guy is, number one. They also don't know if there are robbers there still. Might happen. Plus that, they'll be unclean for a while and they can't perform their duties. Right? We're going to talk about that in a minute. That's okay. I always like people teeing it up for me a minute. So yeah, that's a very famous experiment. And I'll tell you in just a moment. Why does Jesus tell the story the way he does? This is one of those wonderful stories, by the way, Jesus tells, and twist and saying he pulls the rug out from under him. Why does he tell the story that way? Would he listen a different way? Well, we remember this. It's pretty simple when it comes down to that. Why did the lawyer finally answer the way he did? He wouldn't say Samaritan. Why? This is something you developed. Yeah. What happens if because the Samaritan's the hero? How does that change that story? Does it hit you different if you don't think he's going to be able to do that? That's an interesting idea. This is the story that Diana was talking about the other day, a while ago. So in 1973 at Princeton University, the psychology department had a plan. They wanted to measure a single concept, which is, will people stop and help someone if they know they need help or not? But in this study in 1973, what they did was they recruited seminarians And they assigned all of them to preach a devotional on the topic of the Good Samaritan today. Simple, easy. Even a seminarian can handle that one. What they did not know is they didn't care if they presented devotional. Instead, they got a shill, the psychology part got a shill, and they put him in the path of every seminarian, and they set them all at different times to different places. And as the seminarians would come by, the man would groan in pain, "Can you help me? Can you help me?" Hardly any of them stopped. And you know why? I've got to go present my sermon on the Good Samaritan. Does that not strike you as strange? What you're about to say, you can put into practice, but because I'm too busy trying to say it, I can't put it into practice? Oh, there's the sin of preaching sometimes. It's easier to tell you what's right and do what's right. And so the question is, would you help? Would you be a good Samaritan? And we say, we will. Really? Would you? I'm not sure I would all the time. I've run by my share of problems because I don't want to be involved, because I'm in a hurry, because there's already other people there, because the police are coming, for any number of reasons. It's harder to put in practice, especially if you start thinking even a Samaritan can do this. The last passage is what I call a Thanksgiving passage. Luke chapter 17, where you've got the lepers, the 10 lepers. They're in Samaritan territory. They come to Jesus, and from a distance, they cry, "Unclean," says, "Have pity on us, cleanse us." And so Jesus said, "Go show yourself a priest, you're clean." Doesn't have to do anything, doesn't have to touch them. And so they all go away to the priest, and one of them comes back. And he expresses gratitude. And when Jesus tells the story, it says, he threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. He was a Samaritan. And Jesus asked this incredulous question. Has no one else returned to praise God except for this foreigner? Listen to that word. Then he said, "Rise and go, your faith has made you well." You look at that story, which again is well known. Why is it significant that only one returned? Thank Jesus. How thankful are you for things? You know, that's a hard thing to do. We tend to say thank you easily, suppose. For some of us, it's easier than others because we grew up in the age of Captain Kangaroo, where the magic words were please and thank you. Today, we have Netflix that teaches blood and gore, okay? We moved a long way from Captain Kangaroo. And so kids today don't know how to do this. I don't know if you've learned that or not. My grandkids, my granddaughter, my oldest granddaughter, my 12-year-old, Vicky took them clothes shopping for school last week. I've told this story before. She thinks the Louis Vuitton purse of middle schoolers is a Lululemon bag. If you don't have a Lululemon bag, you're just nobody. I'm a nobody because I don't have one. And so she said, "I've got one. Can I get another one?" She said, "Well, you go ask them." "Well, you go ask them." So they give her a bag for free. And she starts turning around. And my wife says, "And what do you say?" Now, she still got her back to the clerk going, "Thank you." She said, "Turn around. Now tell him." My wife can be tough. She does that to me all the time. And you'll go tell her that, won't you? I know what's going to happen next. And so we don't do this normally. We don't do this naturally. We have to have it ingrained on us. And so it's interesting that the 9 Jews take it for granted that Jesus is supposed to do this for them. Now, why does he mention the Samaritan? Why does he call him a foreigner? What makes this story so potent is that the one who had not been given the blessings of God for centuries is the one most grateful to God for what this one little gift. It's interesting. What causes him to return is this sense of someone has given me something I could never have. And it's somebody that I would have never expected. This is the case where someone has done something good for someone you don't like. So, how do we relate to the Samaritans? An interesting problem. We all meet Samaritans. Guys like in the story at the beginning, people we look past that we don't think about, we go, oh, one of those. How do you relate to the Samaritans? It's interesting, the problem here, that as we come to a close, there are a couple of things I think to notice. We don't always see ourselves as we should. I like the story of the Good Samaritan because the lawyer thinks he's a good neighbor. He's not a good neighbor. The Samaritan is a good neighbor. We look at ourselves and we absolve ourselves of responsibilities at times, when really what we ought to do is be looking at ourselves and saying, here's who we are and here's what we need to do. Here's who we need to be. And so we should see others differently and we should see ourselves differently. Someone has said we tend to be hard on others and easy on ourselves, when probably we need to be hard on ourselves and easy on others. Perhaps that's the best case. But the other is all men are redeemable, regardless of their background. People cannot help who they are, to where they've been, who they're born, what their backgrounds were, even the language they speak. You're going to revert to English no matter what you learn on Duolingo. I've been doing Spanish for 2,700 days now. I can do it, but if you want me to tell you what something's going to happen, it's going to be in English. Because I'm not going to go through this. ¿Cómo está? This is going to revert to who you are. People can't help being that way. And so all men are redeemable, regardless of their background. We may forget that. That's the big lesson in Luke. Jesus came to seek and save that which is lost. The lost are never lost forever. We're going to talk about that next week. So the Samaritans, as bad as they were treated, Jesus went and said, you are redeemable as well. And that's true about our world today. Next week, we're going to talk about the lost, because Luke loves to talk about the lost people. So we'll see you again next week.